Can you speak further or expand further on this issue of costing of the ERGP and the rollout, which is something we found very interesting from the analysis?
Well, the truth is, fiscal policy itself is forward-looking. And
Yes.
when you look at costing is also it's forward-looking. So it's just in tandem with fiscal policy.
Okay.
But more importantly, it's that what Proshare, the Proshare Confidential came out was that we need to cost the ERGP such that we can also we can come to terms that what's the total value in terms of capital expenditure and current expenditure that we will, as a country, will be incurring for the next 4 years. And more importantly, it's that it also gives us an avenue to also make a balance, needed trade-offs that we want in terms of interest rates and also in terms of long-term. By doing so, it avoids us falling into what many will refer to as debt hangovers. And that is key, because when you are able to cost it, you can know the total value. It helps you to know the proper kind of debt mix in terms of interest, in terms of long-term, and also short-term. And that is very important. What you had in the ERGP was ex-ante inflation. But now, when you're talking about ex-post inflation and exchange rate, because we know very well that inflation and exchange rate, they are not totally in control. The MPC they do not have total control.
That's the Monetary Policy Committee.
Yeah, they don't have total control of inflation and exchange rate.
Okay.
So in certain times, fiscal authorities also, it allows you, because of your total cost, to readjust to inflation and exchange rate. So by costing it, you can also make needed adjustments when necessary. That is also very, very key. And also in terms of a rollout plan, you look at countries like Brazil, countries like Turkey, who had carried out developmental plans. They also most of these developmental plans are actually divided into stages or phases.
Developmental phases.
And
I think we had something like that in the military era before this time. We had this first, second, and third. Let me not take you back, but just go on.
So it should be divided into developmental phases. But the rollout plan, what it does is that it ushers the development. It's symbolic, very symbolic. And also because households have been largely depressed in terms of consumption. You know that the value of the naira has lost its value, both internal and external. So what the rollout plan does is that it also helps you to solve issues like hanging fruits in terms of like the social intervention. And it is also clear about the kind of capital infrastructure the government will go on with for the next 18 months. By so doing, private institutions also can lock into it because they're certain that there's fiscal clarity in terms of tax, clarity in terms of expenditure, and also fiscal clarity in terms of both in terms of programs and policies and projects. So that is what.
So in essence, it doesn't crowd out the private sector, rather it integrates them.
It integrates them into the process. So that is very key. So you need to cost it, such that you can also ensure that your budget you can readjust both to exchange rates and also to inflation, and also to make the necessary trade-offs.
Now, also raised was the issue of a benchmark, the need for benchmark targets, which all ministries are involved and policymakers understand how they interplay to ensure that it really works out. Can you explain further on this?
Yeah, it's very important that you have benchmarks. And a very good example of such benchmark is like the open budget benchmark. Okay. You have the HD benchmark, and you also look at your private contribution. If I might remind you, you know that Nigeria, for instance, in the open budget, we're having open budget rank. We scored 24 out of 100. That's 2015, although a survey should be out soon in 2017.
Okay.
But what it simply says is that in the open budget rank is that it ensures efficient implementation, oversight. It also ensures that you have private participation, public participation. And when you score very low in such ranks like this, in terms of implementing your budget, it's very poor. It also affects the way you use fiscal multipliers to drive growth. Because countries that have been able to have very strong, score very high in terms of these benchmarks, are countries who also have been able to ensure that fiscal multipliers have been used, not just being used, but used timely. Not like when you pass a budget and you then have to wait for a very long time. So you need that kind of benchmarks. And at the same time, it helps your qualitative indicators, such that you don't just rely on just quantitative indicators. And that's one of the things that's very important. really to ensure that we get this ERGP working. Because if you don't get that, it cannot. It's very hard for you to measure how you have performed. And it also makes it very hard for you to also readjust, because when you cannot measure a budget in terms of performance over time, it's very hard for you to also change whatever policies and move on. And two is that because such benchmarks also are also targeted at institutions, and we know very well that these institutions are the ones that are responsible for resource distribution. So if you don't have benchmarks like the open budget rank, like the private contribution, like the local content, it makes it very hard for you to say, okay, how efficient are these institutions? Because you also need them. They are the ones who are the drive. Apart from the fact that they are the drivers of the good, they are the ones who also distribute resources. So, which is also very key, and that's why the Proshare Confidential was very plain about that. That you must emphasized on that need, that you must create specific targets, even for institutions, for ministries, for MDAs, such that it can help qualitative growth. And you know very well that in the needs are just the needs and the seeds. The MDAs themselves are the ones that help to look at issues like qualitative growth, issues like which boils down like even unemployment, like underemployment, that look like child immortality. And if you cannot create targets for these MDs and ensure that there are oversights, ensure that they are carrying out their responsibilities well, it will affect qualitative growth, and that is very key for a country like ours.
Now, when we look at monetary policy, which is very critical, and looking at your commentary on it, you said our country, there's a need to achieve competitive, real, effective exchange rate, which will ensure that non-oil exports take advantage of price competition. How is this feasible?
Well, it's very feasible. I think let's clarify. For instance, now you will know very well that the central bank have been actually sterilizing its. It has increased its intervention in the market.
It's almost getting to $3 billion between February and now.
And all this also come at a cost.
Yes.
They come at a real cost. And what are the costs? Number one is that we found that as at the 10th of May, our reserve had reached $30.9 billion. As at now, it's 30.62. Yes. So the cost is that the manner at which we had ensured accretion in reserve, we have moved from accretion now to a depletion in reserve, which is also a cost. Two is that we also found the more they sterilize, the overnight rates and also the open back rates also are very volatile, because what it does is that it goes to when you buy you actually are buying naira. Therefore, the rates are also very volatile. So by so doing, those are the real costs. But then the real effective exchange rate is that it allows most countries in the world now, if you want to achieve price stability, when you want to achieve price competitiveness, you need your real effective exchange rate to be relatively low. In the 1990s and sometimes in the early 2000s, you found out that Japan's growth was very low. And why was that? Was that you found out that the yen was very high. When you have a strong yen, it actually affects their growth. Yes. So because people won't want to buy because the cost of goods have increased. Sometimes last year, when also you had a very strong dollar, you found out that a company like even CATS, for instance, actually had their sales reduced abroad. So in country like in Nigeria, for instance, so you need a very strong, real effective exchange rate to ensure that you can optimize exports. For instance, in 2014, we made non-oil exports actually made $10 billion. That's huge. And why? Because our real effective exchange rate as at that time was actually 69. And let's not forget that even during the Soludo's era, one of the reasons we had very strong reserves, which even went as far as $54 billion, was that we ensured that we weakened our real effective exchange rate. And that was one of the debates we had.
Oh, it was weakened.
It was weakened. Now, it was a debate with even the central bank, the policymakers, and with the IMF that our currency was actually weakened. But then the debate was that, one, it allows you to build your reserves. And also it strengthens your BOP, your balance of payment. So the reality is you need a strong, real effective exchange rate, which in order to ensure that you have a strong BOP, to also ensure you have strong accretion in reserves. Because you cannot consistently sterilize the market. Because especially in an economy like ours, whereby there are no implicit or explicit money supply rules, what it does is that it just ensures it's your money rates, your call money rates are very volatile. So investors cannot lock into short-term rates, and that's very dangerous too.
Well, on the Article 4 of IMF, the International Monetary Fund, what are their commentaries, particularly on the issues on inflation and growth for the ERGP?
Article 4 was very clear. They said that we're going to have very low growth. Starting with 2017, our growth will be 0.8, and it will continue with about 1 point. We'll have 1.9, 1.8. Then later, it will therefore fall again to 1.8% growth. Inflation for them will be double digits, unlike the ERGP, whereby they insist that our inflation will be at single digits. So there was a contradiction between both the ERGP and the IMF. But what struck most was that they were of the opinion that the exchange rates, that this multiple exchange rate regime should be discarded off. And I think that was one thing that was very striking. And they emphasized
discard the multiple exchange rates. They're very striking. And then, as we wrap up, what is the position of Proshare Confidential for growth and inflation? And also, what is the key takeaway that policymakers should take from this report?
I think Proshare was clear with that particular report. They stated that inflation at this particular point in time, whereby you have very high levels of credit outputs, and at the same time, you also find yourself in a scenario whereby you have also high inflation, that there should be a balance, that there should not be, you shouldn't make trade-offs, that what you should do is that you should take a monetary policy. Monetary policy should be more multi-enforcing, whereby they should ensure that there should be a balance both between inflation at the same time, also with growth. Because let's not forget that this is a country who has, for a very long time, also had been below its potential growth for almost 2 decades. So if you're now saying that you want to stifle out growth for a very long period, it might also not be in the interest of the nation, social-wise. Then secondly was that it was also very clear that on NRIs, that the government should also use non-residential investments and deposits, which is key because other countries are using that. And lastly, also, it also emphasized that you should also use what many of us refer to as wholly capitals, such as licenses, trademarks, and subcontracting and concessionary, because we found out that this does not just solve issues of FDI, but then what it does is that it provides you the technology you need, and it also solves the issue of skill debt that is affecting this country. If you can remember, sometimes in the 1990s, countries like Malaysia, countries like Indonesia, some like South Korea, they were able to advance, not really by non-remittance, but rather by this form of capital, which is key. And I think we need to take advantage of that because we have a very high youth population, and the demography actually works for us because we also have the market. That is key.